So, from here, let's talk about some of the effects of industrialization because, like I said at the start of this video, this is the most significant and probably dramatic change in human lifestyle since the agricultural revolution, around 8,000 BC. This impacts the social structure. This impacts people culturally, economically, politically, just down to their where and how they live. So we're going to talk about the social upheaval that comes along with industrialization first. Um, One of the classes that uh, feels the biggest impact from industrialization is the aristocracy. These are the ancient landed nobility. These are the people that have held power within these societies going all the way back to, classical times, post Roman times in Western Europe. These are the nobility, these are the people with the land and the castles who serve as lords under feudalism. And it's not until industrialization that they start to see that power and status decline. And the reason that they see their power and status decline is because with the rise of industrialization, a new form of wealth has been created. And that new form of wealth is industrial production. Um, Now, up to this point in history, the only stable source of wealth, like long term wealth, was the ownership of land. Land didn't go away. It could be passed down through generations. You could rent it, you could produce food or cash crops on it. If it was strategically located, you could tax it. You could tax people who lived on it, tax people who traveled or through it. You could tax trade that moved along it. So for most of human history, the only real long lasting source of wealth is land. But with industrialization, now large scale wealth, factories, machines, labor, raw materials, finished goods, right? These things can be produced in relatively small areas at incredibly high rates of speed. So the amount of wealth generated from land through either the production of cash crops or taxation or trade um, is pretty quickly dwarfed by the amount of wealth that can be produced by industrial production. And the landed nobility and the aristocracy begin to lose their power and their status because their source of wealth is no longer the most advantageous to own. Now, the people who benefit the most from this decline in land are what we call the industrial middle class. And there's a number of different titles that get assigned to them. The nouveau riche or the new rich. These also become known as the white collar people, meaning that they work in jobs where they don't get their hands dirty, hence they can have white collars on their shirts. Now, the industrial middle class begins to rise thanks to the ability of industrial production to generate large amounts of wealth really, really quickly. So these people are, for the most part, the capitalists. These are the businessmen, these are the factory owners, these are the investors, and even to a smaller degree, doctors, lawyers, and other professionals, right? Now, politically, the majority of them are pretty liberal in favor of progress and moving forward because again, it benefits them. They are more than willing to get rid of the old titles and the old lands and the privileges that come along with them because they're the new class on the rise. They also in a lot of cases take on social causes, things like social improvement, the creation of a social safety net with things like welfare, disability, public education. And one of the things that they're most obsessed with is striving for what they call moral respectability. They want to be respected for their good acts and for their contributions to society. Um, Even though, in order to attain this middle class, they have to ruthlessly exploit the other social class, the other big social class of this time period, which is the industrial working class, known as the laborers. And this is the class that suffers the most on behalf of industrialization. They work and live in absolutely horrific conditions. They perform exhausting physical labor, whether it's harvesting raw materials to power factories, or whether it's working excessive hours with very little rest and no break in order to keep industrial production moving 24 hours a day. Um, Another thing about this industrial working class that is unlike the peasant or the working classes of past eras is that they're almost entirely urban. The rural population, the people who have been the peasant class and the working class for thousands of years, now, thanks to technical innovation in agriculture, they no longer have to be there. We are able to generate enough food with a smaller portion of the population to feed mass amounts of people, millions and millions of people who don't have to participate in agriculture anymore. Um, for the most part, this industrial working class lacks resources, they lack education, and they lack opportunities for advancement. They are essentially locked into this industrial working class with no real hope of escaping it. One of the other things about this industrial working class, which is unique when you compare it to, the working classes and the peasant classes that came before them, where for the first time in human history, entire families have to work outside of the home in order to survive. Meaning that women and children have to enter the paid workforce earlier and more often than they ever have in history. And one of the reasons for this is because wages in the industrial era are so low. And unfortunately, the fact that women and children enter the wage market just simply drives those wages down even further. But when we get to the economic boom, we'll talk more about that. Now, another part of the social upheaval that comes along with industrialization is the changes in the roles of women. And these are clearly defined also by social class. Um, the influx of wealth into the middle class really kind of takes middle class women out of the labor market completely. It creates this kind of cultural phenomenon that we call the cult of domesticity, meaning that middle class women were seen as too delicate, too respectable for work outside of the home. And that instead they should strive for that moral respectability and the upward mobility. They want to strive to attain the same status and the same level of social grace as the nobility and the aristocracy above them. And one of the ways that they did this was through what they called noble pursuits. So, what you see during this time period is a lot of middle class women kind of abandoning the feminist ideals that, said, give us access to labor, give us access to economic opportunities, give us access to educational opportunities. And instead, they begin pursuing causes in the social and in the political arena. Things like, helping the poor, establishing orphanages, the founding of the Red Cross. These are noble pursuits that are taken up by middle class women who now have the wealth to leave the home, but also feel that leaving the home for work is beneath their status in this new middle class. Now, that doesn't mean that all members of the middle class can afford to engage in these noble pursuits. Those that do have to work outside of the home generally will only work in what we call semi-professional fields, fields that are seen as suitable for women of their social stature, meaning things like secretaries, typists, phone operators, nursing. This is the era where nursing becomes a female dominated industry because it's seen as a somewhat respectable field that women of the middle class can engage in. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum, because of the low wages available to the working class, almost all working class women are forced into the labor market. So as the middle class women are exiting the labor market, middle class, or I'm sorry, working class women are being driven into it in massive numbers. And for the most part, they have to work in order to survive. And what this does unintentionally on their part, but intentionally on the part of business owners in the middle class, is it unfortunately drives wages lower. As women enter the labor force and they begin to replace men in certain fields and in certain tasks, because of obviously a long and well established patriarchy, women are, for the most part, always paid less than men, whether that's because they're seen as more frail or not as physically able. I mean, there's dozens of different reasons why that we've talked about ad nauseum in this class. But this is the beginning of a social stigma and a social problem, which is still being hotly debated and worked on today, which is the beginning of a gender wage gap, where women with relatively even, with relatively comparable experience and relatively comparable skill and relatively comparable, capabilities are generally just paid less than similarly capable men. And in fact, even in the early years of industrialization, even working class women were still relegated to fields that were seen as suitable for women, mainly in the production of textiles and clothing. So here you have some images of kind of the working class women. As you can see, they work in and right alongside men in a lot of industries, but there was also some gender segregation within women. Certain fields were seen as more feminine. Like I said, the clothing production industry was almost entirely feminine. The textile business was almost entirely feminine because, again, these were seen as more womanly pursuits. Now, the final thing that we want to talk about in terms of the social upheaval is the role that children play in industrialization. And I don't want to give the impression that this is the first time in human history that children work, because it's not. But the method and the conditions and the means by which children work all change dramatically. Um, One of the reasons that children enter the labor force in such large numbers during this time period is because of the low wage scale that drives both parents essentially out of the house and forces them to work. And because of that, children, as soon as they are remotely physically capable, sometimes as early as 5 or 6 years old, are also being driven into the workforce. Now, in past eras, children had, once they reached physical maturity, contributed labor, but it was more in the sense of they would contribute labor as in the form of an apprenticeship where they would learn a trade, at the tutelage of a master builder or some other expert in the field, or they would simply help with subsistence farming and agriculture, where entire families would live and work together and take care of animals, crops, and whatnot to generate enough food to survive on. But during industrialization, this is the first time where you see large amounts of children essentially shoved into the paid labor force. And unfortunately, for the most part, children tend to work in the most dangerous fields and conditions for a number of reasons. One, their smaller size is an advantage in terms of where they can work and the type of work that they're able to do. Things like chimney sweeping, coal carrying, machine repair are all more suited for children because they can work in and around tight spaces and large machinery better than a full size adult can. Now, unfortunately, just like with the arrival of women into the labor market, when children start entering the labor market on a small scale, this drives wages even further down because, again, children are seen as less capable and therefore can be paid significantly less than even women or men. Um, in terms of the human effects, child labor is severely crippling because many of these children are working in unsafe, unhealthy, dangerous environments that not only lead to accidents, but the amount of labor and the amount of hours of labor that they're required to put in while their bodies are still developing lead to crippling diseases. They lead to massive growth deformities, and the dangerous nature of the work leads to serious injuries and a lot of times death. So child labor during the industrial era is a pretty tragic thing, and it becomes one of the first major social causes taken up by the middle class in the 19th century. And for the most part, the first legal reforms that you see, geared toward improving the conditions of the working class are designed to help regulate or end child labor in industrialized countries, right? So you see here some images of child labor in the 19th and 20th century. Like I said, these children were often put into the most dangerous situations because of their size. They were oftentimes forced to work in and around very large, very dangerous machinery with little to no safety precautions or safety equipment. You can see from this photo alone that this kid is standing on what looks to be a very, kind of fast-paced machine processing yarn, wearing extremely loose clothing and no shoes. That clothing could be easily caught on one of these machines, and more than likely that child is going to lose a finger, an arm, their life rather quickly, right? Um, you know, as I said, the working conditions here are incredibly detrimental to childhood development. Factory accidents, like the one that you see on the left there, are rather common. Also, children work in, types of jobs that, lead to the development of long-term disease. Chimney sweep was a very popular job for young children because of their size. They could be lowered into chimneys or climb up chimneys in order to clean them, which is going to lead to massive lung and respiratory problems later on in life as well. One of the more common jobs for children was also coal carrying. This was because children, and based on their size, were ideal for bringing large amounts of coal up out of very small and very narrow mine shafts. And again, this incredibly physical labor is going to have long-term effects on their growth and their bone development. Um, again, the conditions are, absolutely horrid, especially when it comes to child labor.